will be a commented reading that I will do on ACROPOLISPLAY, which is our streaming platform. On ACROPOLISPLAY, I have been doing commented readings there, but it's not just commenting on a chapter. I have been reading it sentence by sentence and commenting. I just did this with another wonderful book, which are the Maxims of Ptahhotep. I gave a lecture here on YouTube where I talked about the general ideas, but over on ACROPOLISPLAY, I read and commented on it phrase by phrase. And now, as incredible as it may seem, it's quite bold, but I will do the same with the Corpus Hermeticum. So today, I brought you the basic elements of the Corpus Hermeticum. Many times people ask, but what is this? You've already talked about the Kybalion. You've talked about the Emerald Tablet. What is the Corpus Hermeticum? That's exactly what we aim to do in this lecture. I made a point of using this name, Basic Elements, precisely to show that we are talking about the foundations, so we can understand what it's about. I invite you then to get to know a little better this so-called Corpus Hermeticum. Welcome. Well, Corpus Hermeticum, the name corpus itself already indicates. The corpus means a body of texts. You took texts that were separate, scattered, and put them all together into a collection, a condensation. In other words, you turned into a single book things that were separate manuscripts. The Corpus Hermeticum is the conjunction of various treatises of Hermetic origin that were at a certain point transformed into a single work. This question of origins is also always another complicated issue, because it seems that the writing of the Corpus Hermeticum was done in Greek around the 2nd or 3rd century. And this has caused a lot of controversy throughout history. How can it be? Hermes Trismegistus, or Trismegistus, as you prefer, is a character whose life is dated around 1,500 to 2,500 years before Christ. Where was this document until the 2nd, 3rd century of the Christian era? It happens that people often forget the way the Egyptians, the Indians, and sometimes even the Greeks deal with their sacred works. There was great care in these traditions in writing sacred texts, especially texts like those of Hermes Trismegistus, because they are extremely esoteric with a language that is difficult to understand. This was passed down through oral tradition. It turns out that the body of teachings of Hermes Trismegistus included certain teachings that were derived from them, such as astrology, horoscopy, medicine, and various treatises of this kind, which were secondary to the fundamental doctrine, and were found to date back to even 3 centuries before Christ. Evidently, these treatises were based on this central doctrine, only it wasn't explicit. It wasn't that easy to find. So, this material was compiled in the 2nd to 3rd century AD. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist before. This doesn't mean that it wasn't ancient. In fact, because the primitive Egyptian language, the way of writing through hieroglyphs, long before it reached the Demotic, which is simpler, is very complex to identify. It took Champollion to come along for someone to understand anything. So, what happened? In ancient times, when these manuscripts were discovered at the beginning of the Christian era, they were highly valued and were evidently considered to be of Hermetic origin. There was great respect for Egypt, both from the Greeks and the Romans. So much so that people say, since it was written in Greek, it was probably altered. There wasn't the same mindset as today. The Greeks had a true devotion for Egyptian knowledge. They drank deeply from Egyptian knowledge. Therefore, they clearly declared themselves inferior in their knowledge to what Egypt knew. They would hardly tamper with something that was so admired. The Egyptian tradition continues to develop even during the time of the Ptolemies in Alexandria. She didn't collapse all of a sudden. These texts also passed through the hands of Egyptian priests and hierophants. When Alexander the Great founded his Alexandria there, which became a cultural hub where the great library was built, attracting texts from all over the world, Egypt was still very much alive. The texts that were sent there came, indeed, still very much alive from Egypt. To give you an idea, the Library of Alexandria, which is not the topic of our conversation, is worth a lecture in itself. But it was such a rich library that they say even Buddhist documents from Ashoka, the great Buddhist emperor of India, ended up there. Something was transcribed from Buddhism and ended up there. And they were documents from all over the world. Evidently, Egyptian documents too, quite intact. Well, we know that this library was burned once again, a lot was lost. But the fact is that in antiquity and even in the Middle Ages, we will see this at the end, many great names trusted and took the Corpus Hermeticum very seriously, the fragments of it, which was what they came to know. And then we have a huge list in the preface of this book. Very carefully, the translator includes a huge list of names influenced by this Corpus Hermeticum. Clement of Alexandria himself goes so far as to say that there were 42 Hermetic treatises, meaning that probably much was lost after his assessment, and many other thinkers, both from ancient times and the medieval period. When we reach the modern and contemporary age, more or less from the Enlightenment onwards, where a lot of exaggerated rationalism came to the fore, there began to be a whole murmur, a noise, a clamor around this work, saying that no, this was not legitimate, this was not ancient, this was nothing of the Egyptians, this was a Greek invention, an invention of the Greek philosophers. Fortunately, many events have occurred from the 20th century onwards, especially, that have led to this respect that this work had would be regained. We will see that it was a difficult journey. So, this collection of dedicated texts, known as of Hermetic origin, that is, of Hermes Trismegistus, not necessarily only from the master, but also from the brotherhood of priests, of hierophants, that was created around him. This is more or less unanimous today. It reached the point where it was doubted whether this Hermetic brotherhood had really existed. Such was the discredit that was cast upon this document. And today, fortunately, he is once again considered and respected as such, as he deserves, due to many other things that have come to light. So, the corpus is a collection of texts. Among many transcriptions back and forth, a part of it, which is the part of Asclepius, or the perfect discourse, was a part that survived a lot, was translated into Greek, then was rendered into Latin. They said it might have been done by Apuleius, the great Roman writer and sage, the same one from the Golden Ass. Over time, they discovered that this was nothing more than a legend. It wasn't really Apuleius who did it. But the fact is that this part of the corpus survived for a long time. The scholars of the Chartres school from the 12th century were already well aware of this. They say that the one who discovered this document and brought it back to the attention of his contemporaries for study was Peter Abelard, the philosopher you might know from the film In the Name of God, who was a very prominent philosopher of the medieval period. But anyway, the other documents remained more elusive. It is said that in the 11th century, in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Constantinople, a certain Neoplatonic philosopher named Michael Psellus made a compilation of all these writings that still remained, 14 treatises in Greek. And it is exactly in this region, a bit more towards Mesopotamia, actually, these studies, these writings of Michael Psellus, will be found much later, already in the full Renaissance, at the behest of Cosimo de' Medici. It's a very exciting and interesting story. 15th century, then 1459. This Medici family is a very mysterious family. Everyone knows they were bankers, but both Cosimo and his grandson Lorenzo, the Great, the Magnificent, were very committed to preserving the knowledge of the past, were very Platonic and loved to decode and learn from these lost documents of the past. In other words, from Chaldean codices to Egyptian teachings, everything was of great interest to them. So Cosme, in 1459, sends a monk named Leonardo de Pistola to go to Macedonia. And in Macedonia it was that corpus created by Michael Psellus in Constantinople that was located by this monk. He locates 14 treatises of the Hermetic corpus. The body, folks, is usually composed of dialogues. Since there is an order, it is very interesting. The first of these dialogues, which is the Poimander or Poimander, is a dialogue of God with Hermes. Simply Hermes receives his teachings from God. Poimander is God himself, the One himself, and then he passes on Hermes, passing on this teaching he received to his disciples, like Toddy, like Asclepius, like Ammon. And finally, we have the Chori Cosmo, which is also a dialogue, a discourse from Isis to her son Horus. In other words, all these documents have a form of dialogue. Curious, if you consider it. That Egypt influenced Greece so strongly, the fact that a great thinker like Plato, who declared himself a great admirer of Egypt, also wrote his work in the form of dialogues. Pythagoras lived 20 years in Egypt. And then he learns a lot of things that he will incorporate into his system in his school of Crotona, his Pythagorean museum. The influence on Greece and then on Rome is enormous, and the respect dedicated to Egypt was also very great. So, just to give us some context, the Renaissance, which is such a special event, capable of producing so much beauty, and at the same time so enigmatic, a reawakening after the Middle Ages. I don't go to the extent of saying that the Middle Ages was a long night. If I find it a bit exaggerated, there was a lot of interesting stuff happening there in the middle, but the fact that interests changed a lot when the Renaissance was born is undeniable. And the fact that this mysterious family from Florence, the Medici, had such a strong influence on all of this. Cosme would go around picking up artists from the street, bringing them to his home, sponsoring these artists so they could create their works under his support. Due to his economic power, he had influence over the Vatican. The Medici even ended up producing a pope. And he managed to ensure that what was of his interest was protected. There was a very famous council of Basel Ferrara Florence, which began in 1438 and ended in 1439. It was nothing more than a visit to Italy, Italian cities, by the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine Emperor. Because we all remember the division of the Catholic Church, the schism of the Catholic Church of the West and the East. By that time, already in the 15th century, there was the danger that Constantinople would be attacked by the Ottoman Turks, as indeed happened. So there was a concern to preserve the wealth of Christianity accumulated in that city. Therefore, what is attempted in this council is the reunification of the Catholic Church of the West with the East. These great authorities come to Italy. A large delegation coming to try to negotiate this unification. So, in this delegation, first this council begins in the city of Ferrara. Cosme, very clever, sees that a plague was starting in Ferrara and says, no, this council cannot stay in Ferrara. It has to come to Florence. As it seems he wasn't very convincing with that argument, he went to the Pope and said, if the council comes to Florence, it'll pay for everything. That was a convincing argument. He succeeded. This council ended in Florence. He managed to bring all those Byzantine authorities to his city, the city where he held power. And then it's very interesting because he comes into contact with some figures, because within this Socratic delegation coming from Constantinople, you had not only exponents of the Catholic Church, but also, for example, philosophers, Neoplatonists with Jorge Gemistus Platon. Gemistus Platon was a Byzantine philosopher who loved Plato so much that he changed his own name. This surname Platon is a tribute to Plato, and he is a great admirer of Platonic knowledge, and also the other man of the church, who was the Archbishop of Nicaea named Basil Bessarion. And these two come along with this entourage. Well, Basilio Bessarion went there, coming with a Christian delegation. But Platon was not even a Christian, and comes along with the entourage, who knows why. There is even a painting that depicts this embassy, this delegation from Constantinople, and there is a small painting, a little character in a corner, who is Jorge Gemistus Platon. And this philosopher then begins to give long lectures attended by Cosimo, taking advantage of the event of the council in Florence. He enchants Cosimo, who admires his knowledge. He convinces Cosimo de' Medici to create a new Platonic academy in the West. And he gets excited about this idea and creates what is Plato's Academy of Crete, where every year Plato's birthday was celebrated, and where not only Plato was studied, but also Chaldean oracles, the Hermetic corpus, and a bunch of other things that were translated by a brilliant disciple named Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was still very young, the son of a doctor from Florence, and he is almost adopted by Cosimo de' Medici, who commissions him to translate these texts into Latin. So he first translates the Corpus Hermeticum. Being a very ancient text, there was great interest in it. So for the first time, the corpus as a whole, remember Asclepius, had already been translated. The corpus comes into Latin and then is even translated into the Italian of the time. And many other texts of high interest for academic studies, but very strong within that still prevailing context of the Middle Ages. But Florence, the Renaissance, was very liberal in its first phase. He becomes repressed after the Counter-Reformation comes, when all those freedoms of the Renaissance are cut off. But at first, there was a lot of interest in studying all of this. But there was a fierce political dispute between those Italian cities, each one independent, each one with its own leaders. We will see that many of these wonderful painters were protected by some of these patrons. For example, in Milan, Ludovico Sforza was the protector, the patron of Leonardo da Vinci. There in Florence reigned the absolute Cosimo and the Medici who succeeded him. Right. So, the 14 treatises that were brought from Macedonia were translated by Marsilio Ficino. O Asclepius, as we have already mentioned, already existed. Asclepius is named Logos Telios, or perfect discourse. The Asclepius, as I already mentioned to you, was already known since the 11th century, and it was considered by Marsilio Ficino, by Pico della Mirandola, and many others who passed through there, the heritage of Hermes Trismegistus as the perennial philosophy, that is, the knowledge that is behind all universal traditions, the Prisca theology, or primordial, from which all religions came, reaching a point within the Christian circle to consider that. Hermes Trismegistus was in no way contradictory to Christian teaching, nor was Plato. They were very well accepted. So this enormous interest in Hermes was further increased with this translation into Latin by Marsilio Ficino. In 1490, 1490, another seeker, Lodovico Lazzarelli, also an Italian, discovers a new Greek manuscript, which he translates himself. Now the difference from the previous manuscript, translated by Marcello Ficino, is that this one contained 3 more treatises. There were 17 treatises in total, not counting the Asclepius. And after that, several versions of the Corpus Hermeticum were created. Even today, if you look at the translations, they are distinct from each other. Some consider fragments, others do not consider fragments. Some work with the 14 treatises of the Laurentian manuscript, which is the first one, the other does not. The other has 17, each manuscript has a name, has a location, and they are somewhat differentiated from each other. That besides that we also have to include, within this corpus, the 14 of Marcello and Ficino, plus these 3 that were discovered by Lodovico and Lazzarelli, plus the perfect discourse, the Asclepius, plus some fragments that also come from ancient times, translated into Greek by various writers, and another wonderful thing that happened in the 20th century, which is the discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, called the Gnostic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi, which among them contain things that are not Gnostic at all, such as, for example, unpublished parts of the Corpus Hermeticum. Then we will see some other speeches that were also added later. This was a marvel from various points of view. First of all, if you discover a manuscript of such antiquity in the hands of a certain people who studied it, that is, original from such a remote time, the beginning of the Christian era, it becomes difficult to say that all of this was copied by the Greeks and that it was invented by the Greeks. It is not possible because there were other groups that knew the same document. Therefore, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts and also the one originating from the Library of Alexandria had a common source, certainly in Egypt itself. The position that there were no Hermetic bodies in Egypt and that it was a Greek invention is no longer sustainable. Do you understand this? A new source of Hermetic manuscripts has been discovered, showing that other peoples also drew from this same source, not just the Greeks. This also added some interesting things to the bodies. It became increasingly dense, filled with more interesting parts. Enigmatic, all of it. The Corpus Hermeticum is tremendously enigmatic, and it couldn't be otherwise, because it is meant to be a revelation of fundamental truths, and therefore, fundamental truths are not so readily understood at first glance by just anyone. They require a great effort of refinement, symbolic vision, study, dedication, but it is immensely rich. Extremely rich from the perspective of the wealth of information it brings and the worldview that Egypt had since ancient times. Well, the dialogues, as I mentioned to you, first come the dialogues of Hermes, the great master, who in Egypt was actually called Jud, with the divine intelligence, which is called Poimandro or Poimandres. Poimandres was translated in the Greco-Latin era as shepherd of men. But there is a possibility that the meaning of the word is not that. Come from Egypt, which would be Poimandra, meaning knowledge of the king. Rioja, the primordial light. This name is a name given to the divine being itself, to God himself. And then, as I mentioned to you, Hermes with Tate, Asclepius and Ammon, and Isis with Horus, a part called Korikosmu, which means the pupil of the world, that is, the essence of the vision of the world. It's another separate manuscript, also very interesting and very enigmatic. Instructions of Isis to her son. Let's go. In 1945, as I mentioned to you, in Nag Hammadi, the discourse on the Abdoad and the Ennead was found, which is very interesting because it references the tradition of Egyptian deities and the definitions of Hermes Trismegistus and Asclepius, which are something else, not the Asclepius we were talking about just a moment ago. They are not the perfect speech. And all of this makes up the corpus. Another fact that I find quite interesting, and I've even tried to acquire this book, and it's not easy. Even in a foreign language, bringing it to Brazil is not easy. It's a book, also a manuscript. That was presented in 1995 at the University of Cambridge under the name Book of Thoth by two researchers, Jasnoff and Zalzit. These two researchers would have found this manuscript. It's something more. The so-called Book of Thoth is something more, an unpublished document that came to light in 1995. And as far as I know, it is only translated into German and English. Extremely difficult to import to Brazil. There are certain things that are really hard for us to access. It's a work that I would really like to know. But those who know the work say there is further reinforcement due to its similarities with the Corpus Hermeticum. It is not part of the corpus, but it shows the antiquity of these common sources in ancient Egypt, a tradition that comes from centuries, perhaps millennia. An oral tradition. In other words, it confirms the antiquity of the Corpus Hermeticum by common references, cross-references. Well, as I mentioned to you, in the 20th century, especially a French priest named Festugier created a huge work, a true compendium, debunking the Hermetic corpus, presenting a series of quite inconsistent evidence showing that it was a Greek creation, that none of that had existed in Egypt. This created an influence, not just him, but there were other earlier writers, from the Enlightenment onwards, as I mentioned, but it created a tendency to discredit the Corpus Hermeticum, which caused research on it to practically come to a halt. Until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi documents, the Corpus Hermeticum was largely ignored by scientific study, or at least underestimated, as a Greek document, a document from the early Christian era, with no relation to Egypt. Today it is quite consensual that this was a lie. And many historians, many writers were influenced by this Father Festugier. In the Middle Ages, it's curious, I told you that many greatly admired this book, but others hated it. They spoke of Hermes Trismegistus as a kind of magic, black magic. They vehemently denied the Hermetic corpus. But throughout the entire Middle Ages, interestingly, there were those who loved and valued him greatly. In fact, one of the things I found interesting in the preface of this book, usually I don't recommend prefaces, this one is quite interesting. I congratulate the editor, which shows a series of names, important names, and relevant names, who took the Corpus Hermeticum as an irrefutable base of knowledge and as an unquestionable authority. Returning a bit to Egypt, just so we can understand the figure of this god Thoth, what he means within the Egyptian cosmogony. There was an ancient city called Hermopolis, which, of course, this name came from the Greeks, which is the city of Hermes. But initially, there was a religious body, a cosmic origin of the universe, which was born in Hermopolis, and which directly refers, evidently, to Thoth, to Hermes. In other words, it is the so-called primordial Ogdoad of Hermopolis, which speaks of the very creation of the universe. And it introduces pairs of gods that emerge, those who were not born. It's as if they were always there. After them will come the one who is born by himself, who is Ra. But these are unborn gods, the first to start announcing the moment of creation, of manifestation. These gods would always be pairs. The first pair would be number and nenit. It is just one god in its dual aspects. Every time a manifestation is born, the manifestation is dual. Number and the net represented the ocean of primordial energy. Notice how this story of the ocean where the god Vishnu floated, from his navel comes a lotus from which Brahma is born. This idea of the universe being born from a primordial ocean is very recurrent in traditions. The spirit of God itself hovered over the waters in Genesis. Isn't that so? So, number and Nanit are the ocean of primordial energy, the energy in potential. King and Queen, the infinite. The first elements that are there, waiting for the moment to give birth to the new cosmos. Kek and Kikit are the primordial darkness, that is, the darkness where all things exist in potential. Tenimu and Tenimut, the erratic or primordial unstable. In other words, that element that will come to life, but is not yet fixed. An unstable element waiting for the moment to be fixed so that it can give birth to the manifested universe. From this very undefined beginning, at a certain moment, Tenimu and Tenimut are replaced by Aman and Amanit, who is the one who hides, or the primordial breath. In other words, instability settled in the primordial breath. The first breath, the pneuma, the air that gave, as if it were the universe's first breath. This symbolism of the first breath is very common. And in this first breath, then, represented by Aman and Amanit, the primordial cosmic egg emerges. This egg already guarded by Thoth, because Thoth is born right after this. He is the first engendered, because Aman and Amanit are those who engender themselves. Thoth is the first begotten. This primordial cosmic egg is already guarded by him, watched over by him, and from within this primordial cosmic egg emerges the self-engendered or primordial light, which is Re or Ha, the primordial light. The revealed face of God, the fiat lux, the first light, not a light like the one we know today, but it is the first type of radiation that will give birth. The new manifestation that is about to be born. And then, from this Ogdoad of Hermopolis, from this Heliopolitan Ennead, the Heliopolitan Ennead will be born, which is already the second generation of gods. There was already Thoth there. And after that come the gods of Heliopolis, who are Shu and Tefnut. Shu is the breath, and Tefnut is the moisture. If you look at Scandinavian creation, you have that. The first icy abyss and the scorching fire. In other words, Shu represented this breath, that is, dry, while Tefnut was the moisture. Then comes Jeb, which is the celestial land, and then Nut, who is the celestial sky. It's interesting. I always draw attention to this detail. Why? In the Egyptian tradition, the sky is feminine and the earth is masculine. And this has a very special meaning. It is then considered that the mother who gives birth to the universe, who gives life, the mother is the spirit and not the matter. Life is nourished by the spirit as if matter were merely a vessel. It's interesting, this role reversal. You will find something that somewhat resembles back in Egyptian mythology, where the sun, for example, is associated with a goddess, Amaterasu, a goddess, and it is the sun. In other words, a role reversal that denotes particularities of these mythologies. Then comes Osiris, who is the water of life, and Isis, who is the fertile earth. Osiris, the guardian of the fertile land, the guardian of the waters of fertility. And his brother Set, who is the lord of the desert or the barren land, and Nephthys, who is the arid land. And of these, already finishing the Heliopolitan Ennead, there is Horus the elder. In other words, it's as if that primordial light that originates with Are refracts and now generates a visible light, which is the primordial sun, which is Horus the Ancient. In other words, all these rays of Are, all this successive creation, at a certain moment, it's as if it encounters a barrier that refracts this invisible light, making this light visible. It would be the birth of the sun, Horus, the Ancient One. And then come the third gods, who are usually the ones we know the most. Which is very interesting that this so active third generation reminds us of the third Olympic generation, also in Greece, which is the most active and well-known. The 12 gods of the third Olympic pantheon are the most present within Greek mythology. And the third generation will have Horus, the young, lord of the fertile land, who is the son of Osiris and Isis, will have his half-brother Anubis, who is the lord of the border between the fertile and infertile land, that is, the one who communicates heaven and earth, the psychopomp, the one who takes the souls of the dead to the beyond. Anubis is the son of Osiris and Nephthys. And from there, all the deities we usually talk about, Batet, Sekhmet, and the universe of other gods that come afterward. It already belongs to the younger generation, the third generation born from the Heliopolitan lineage. Interesting, we will notice why everything in Egypt, so first the 8, that is, then the 9, remember that the name of one of the manuscripts is Iniada, which is Ogdoada, that is, the 8 and the 9. Pythagoras, who spent 20 years in Egypt, when he goes to his school in Crotona, his museum, he brings this love for numbers, this mystery of numbers. You will see that the Pythagorean decade bears great resemblance to some of these Egyptian symbolic keys. And the entire meaning of each number, the passage of the Ogiddo, of the Priniata, signifies one more moment in the course of the universe, one more moment in the course of creation with its many symbolic particularities. Well, turning now more towards the wisdom contained in the books of Hermes. I have already had the opportunity to talk with you in the lecture we gave, our long lecture on the Emerald Tablet. Helena Blavatsky says that from the Egyptian traditions, what remains most intact, incredibly enough, is the Emerald Tablet, while the Corpus Hermeticum has undergone insertions over these times, the last centuries of history, but there is still much that is worth knowing. But the fundamental teaching, both on the tablet, in the Corpus Hermeticum, and in the echo of all this which is the Kybalion, is the following. It is possible to achieve a level of strength and control over the earthly world through the knowledge of celestial harmonies, starting from earthly elements. In other words, everything that exists in the world is a reflection, in the material world, a reflection of what exists in the realm of Platonic ideas, in the realm of archetypes, or in the celestial realm. If a man knows how to read these reflections on earth well, he understands the laws of the heavens. If he has a symbolic mindset, if he knows how to read what is behind mere phenomena, if he goes to the origin, to the noumenon, he knows how to read what is behind the simple germination of a plant, he knows how to read the symbolism of all the phenomena that are before his eyes, he reaches the calligraphy of God. Because everything that exists in the world is a reflection of these ideas that are on the celestial plane. Therefore, if a person learns to speak the language of life, they read the laws of heaven reflected on earth. When we speak, classically, for example, of reflection, today we take this word in a very superficial way. The reflection, which closely resembles meditation of Eastern origin, was nothing more than recognizing within oneself the reflections of the world of ideas, of what was conceived for the human being in the realm of ideas. Recognize in oneself these traits of divine calligraphy, that is, learn to read. The symbolic message that exists in every human being, because human creation is also symbolic, obeys the need to manifest something that was in the realm of ideas. Therefore, the reflection would be a symbolic reading of the reason for humanity's existence. In other words, it was profound, not just a simple pause to think about 2 or 3 points. And that was, like many other concepts, an impoverishment, an emptying of the word. Hermes teaches his disciples through dialogues how to transcend bodily circumstances and overcome destiny through the purification of the intellect and contemplation, leading to the true knowledge of God. In other words, imagine that the manifested universe, according to this tradition, had a moment when it was born, meaning that all beings came into matter. This is called the descending arc. In other words, the ideas that were on the plane of ideas manifested here took form. In other words, the universe emerged as such. At a certain moment, it's time for these conscious beings who are down here, with all the ideas they have been able to illuminate through their consciousness, to begin the journey back. There was a time, as you will see if you read a bit about Indian tradition, for example, when beings did not want to descend to the world, did not want to take on a body. And there was a need for a lot of pressure for these spiritual beings to come into the world and take form. Now it's the opposite. It's the ascending arc. It's time for these beings who are here with the body to start detaching from it and start grasping the more subtle and lasting things. Seek eternity, seek divine values, virtues, because the attributes of God are eternal and are all within us. Latent or conscious. In other words, it's the moment of the ascending arc time to start letting go of material fixations, the I, the mine, separate from yours, separate from you, my things and your things, when in truth, things belong to no one. They are just reflections. It's time to start unmasking these misconceptions of manifestation and begin seeking unity with all the virtues that accompany this quest. Fraternity, solidarity, empathy, etc., etc. Begin to tear away the veils of illusion and return home. The ascending arc is a moment of returning home. And what Hermes taught his disciples is this: look, start to disidentify from matter and seek your identity in the divine attributes that also exist within you. Start identifying with things that are truly yours, that nothing and no one can take away from you. Therefore, it is behind the entire Hermetic message, as strong ideas and as a call. Well, some ideas as support for us to understand how this Hermetic system works. In the preface, it is clearly explained in a very interesting way that Hermeticism is not the same as Gnosticism, it is not the same as pantheism, it is not the same as any other system that existed around that time. There are differences. Doctrinally, they have very striking conceptual differences. According to Hermeticism, then, to evolve is to take the path of unity. The more we overcome what in India is called the heresy of separateness, the more we are truly growing, returning home. It is necessary to understand the revelations of divine truth. They are all present here in the world. It is necessary to learn to come. Learn to have a symbolic mindset, to dialogue with life, learn to recognize the handwriting of God in the world. It is necessary to realize that there is a spark of God within man, which is our essence. It's as if we were all small cells at the moment when the expansion occurred. Now these cells dream of returning to the body of which they are a part. Another element that is very strong within Hermeticism and that differentiates it from many other traditions, including early Christianity, Gnosticism, and everything else. Man can know God. As the attributes of God exist very strongly within him, man can come to know God. By deeply knowing oneself, one reaches the threshold of the vision of God. As you will later see in Greece, in the famous phrase of Delphi, "Man, know yourself and you will know the universe and the gods." We know in miniature what exists on a macro level in the universe. The more inside, the more outside. So there is the possibility for man to actually come to know God. God is distinct from the world, but needs the world to complete himself. Creation is necessary. There is a passage in the Kybalion where the author says, for example, Shakespeare and Hamlet. Hamlet is part of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is much more than Hamlet. It would be the same with God. A part of God is the world, but God is much more than just the world. But according to Hermeticism, God created this world not for fun and entertainment, or he might not have created it. He created it out of necessity. God created the world because he needed the world. God is distinct from the world, but needs the world to complete himself. Creation is necessary. Understand that this is very interesting. We find a clear parallel within Pythagorean philosophy. The universe was a void. India says something very similar. The universe was a void. At a certain moment, there's just one seed right in the middle, right? This seed develops and generates a first creator God, a demiurge, which is the number one. From this unity, everything that comes after is created. And the first thing that will be created, the fundamental division, will be spirit and matter, or cosmic ideation and primordial substance, as you prefer to call it. But it is said that this duality is created because consciousness is born through contrast. You can't know what blue is if the entire universe were blue. At some point, he had to stop and start the red, because then you recognize the blue and the red in contrast. Between sound and silence, you recognize both. If a musical note sounded all the time, you wouldn't recognize it. Consciousness is born in contrast. Therefore, according to these ancient traditions, manifestation is a way for this divine being to become even more aware of itself. So it's as if he creates his own mirror. The manifestation, the primordial duality, is God looking at himself in the mirror. And through the images that this mirror provides him, which is the entire history of manifestation, he will become more and more aware of himself. And this ultimately generates a reabsorption of all this at the end of the cycle, once again into unity and a return to zero, which is the decade. Do you understand this idea? So everything that happens in that mirror, every manifestation, all the beings that emerge, are actually cells of God, who go to this illusory world that is the manifestation to gather more and more perceptions of God. Make this effort to return to it, to see it. Because God wants this vision. He increasingly wants his children to come home with their arms full of fruits. Therefore, the world is not something that was created at God's whim. He creates because he needs it. As if each manifestation were to gather a higher degree of self-awareness. Then everything retreats again. Each manifestation in these days and nights of Brahma would be for this divinity to look in the mirror and know its face more deeply and then return to reabsorption. Hence, the Pythagorean tradition itself says that, from this primordial unity, everything else is an illusion created so that the being could, from the outside, create an observer that would allow them to know more about themselves. This observer who will have to walk and come to contemplate it. May this contemplation is useful for both creator and creature. This was part of the Hermetic tradition. Therefore, the universe is not a whimsical, useless creation lacking much quality. Creation is fundamental for God because otherwise he would not have made it. The knowledge of God through the human being is necessary to achieve the completeness of God. It becomes God's knowledge about himself. These are enigmatic ideas, but it's important for us to have a glimpse of them because within the Corpus Hermeticum, those who will continue with us there at ACROPOLISPLAY, we will need this vision, we will need these keys. Well, the three paths, the three successive ways of what they called initiation or the quest for immortality. that you will notice that at certain moments the Hermetic body seems contradictory with itself. There are times when he speaks in a very basic way for someone who is just beginning to perceive the existence of the divine. At other times, he speaks in a very complex manner. And for those who don't know the keys, it seems that the two things are contradictory, when in reality they are just a refinement of an original idea. So, the first path is the path of self-knowledge. Man knowing himself is called the small mysteries. The great mystery of the human condition in the face of the mystery of the universe is a small mystery. To understand what human nature is, where it tends to go, what its perfection is, and how far we are from that perfection. In other words, knowing where you are now, understanding all the tendencies that exist within the human being, to balance them, the lower ones that pull towards the earth, with the higher ones that lift us towards the sky. It is necessary to understand human nature and know how to deal with it very well. What are the first mysteries that bring us closer to Pomander or Poimander? Then, to know God. Once you know the attributes of God manifested in you, it becomes easier to approach Him. In other words, through the attributes we discover in ourselves, we perceive a close kinship between God and us. And finally, the divinization of the human being. In other words, the extinction of separateness. Let me try to explain this in a different way. Well, at first, this human being is trying to know themselves and sees that there is something divine in the universe. But the divine is there and the human is here, separated. In a second moment, this human being realizes that many of the attributes of the divine are within him. Therefore, he recognizes God by his handwriting within him. In other words, he begins to glimpse his own divine nature. But God is there, He is here, and there is a close resemblance. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, in the third moment, there's neither there nor here. Man and God merge into one, like a drop of water entering the ocean. The drop expands in consciousness until it realizes that the ocean and it have always been one. This would be the third way, the third degree of initiation or the quest for immortality, that are very similar to many other things. These keys are quite repetitive. Therefore, if you take the medieval alchemical works, the work in black, the work in white, the work in red, it seems a lot. But if you also take the Platonic cave myth, the stages from slavery, distrust, freeing oneself, leaving the cave, returning, also have a very similar symbolic key. If you take the Zen sequence of the herdsman, which I have already discussed in one of my lectures, which is the origin of man according to the Eastern tradition, it is also very similar. If you take the Tauromachies from all sorts of mythology, what is Tauromachy? A man subduing the bull, you will find this in Mitra, you will find this in Hercules, taming the Cretan bull, you will find this in Egypt itself, when Osiris subdues the Apis bull and becomes with him the god Serapis, who is precisely that healing god, capable of balancing spirit and matter. So it's just the same idea, reflected everywhere. The journey of the human being until reaching the final fusion, represented according to the set of values of each tradition. Another interesting thing is the association made between the stages of human evolution and the characteristics of certain planets. It's a form of astrology that is not horoscope-based, a form of natural astrology that associates the elements of the universe with man in his journey, who is also an element of the universe. Therefore, there is a similarity between the trajectories of the planets and the trajectory of man. And it's possible to foresee the human trajectory a bit by contemplating the step of these stars. And you can associate the two things. This was also part of the Hermetic studies. Well, finally, what we can perceive within all this Hermetic tradition is what we today call metanoia. Metanoia is a concept that is exotic for our current days. We have that popular saying that goes, "A stick that is born crooked dies crooked," right? Do you conceive that a human being born with a very serious defect can reach a certain age in their life absolutely free from that defect? That a person who is intolerant, who is choleric, can reach a certain age in their life as an absolutely serene, balanced, and peaceful person? This is possible. This is what is called metanoia. It is the transformation of man, the transmutation, as was done in alchemy from lead to gold. This metanoia was one of the elements that were contemplated, not with this name, evidently, within the Hermetic tradition. The transformation, the complete transmutation of man into a divine being. The image and likeness of God. And the center of attraction in this whole process is the contact with God. Ever closer, ever more intimate. An increasingly lucid recognition. So it's like a center of attraction for the process. It's like imagining a large cone where at the top there is divine light and human consciousness narrows and ascends to reach it, which is a symbol also very present in Celtic tradition, in our Christmas trees, for example. Well, there is much talk about Egypt and Hermeticism as magic. I don't know exactly what men consider as magic today. It seems a bit like pulling rabbits out of a hat, somewhat negative, somewhat sinister. The magic known in Egypt, at least within what we are able to understand of it, is sympathetic magic. What does that mean? Yes, but pathos, which means to suffer together, is very similar to the word compassion, compassio. Passion, the passion of Christ, for example, is suffering, enduring, that is, to suffer together. It's the idea of removing the boundaries of separateness and having such a great fusion with the whole that the final points of creation become your own concern. The pain of the last being in the corner of the planet hurts you. It is such a great commitment to unity that at a certain moment you merge with it. In other words, it was a magic to eradicate separateness and to feel the entire cosmos as your own body. And you and God as one. This sympathetic magic that was later so emptied, so misunderstood, that today it gave rise to the word sympathy, which is synonymous with superstition. There was a lot of knowledge behind it. It was not a coincidence, nor did it have anything to do with superstition. Well, anyway, as I already told you, said that Hermeticism was the first affirmation of perennial philosophy, that is, the deepest truth that lies behind all the world's traditions, the cradle of the quest for wisdom, a single truth behind the multiple assertions throughout time and across space. And the essence of this message, let's say, the most precise summary is that we must elevate consciousness to God. Another interesting thing that went through Egypt, went through Greece, also went through India, several peoples have this conception, is that a book like the Corpus Hermeticum does not lend itself to a single form of symbolic interpretation. This is important for you to understand. It has multiple layers of interpretation. The deeper you delve into yourself, the deeper you go into a book like this. I think it's right to try to enter with the tools we have now to start the journey, right and necessary. But it's important to know that if we are growing, in 10 years, a new reading of the Corpus Hermeticum will bring us a new book. Helena Blavatsky, who has a quite interesting study on this, said that a traditional myth, a symbolic, sacred book of this magnitude, has at least 7 keys of interpretation. 7 keys to reading. Throughout her work, she goes on to talk about 10 keys, which she later merges into 7 keys. The first one, which is the most common, is the psychological key. It's the only one we get into a little bit. So, if you take, for example, Greek mythology, you will see Kronos eating all his children. You realize that we are being swallowed by this clock time for not approaching Zeus of eternity, which would be the pursuit of wisdom. That is, this is a psychological key. When you see Hercules fighting the Nemean lion, you realize that this has a psychological key, which is the fact of a man mastering his own anger, taking away its air, taking away its breath, because he covers the lion's nostrils. But also, these 12 labors of Hercules are related to the 12 zodiac houses and the sun's transit through them. It is also a myth of astronomical, astrological origin. There is a key to interpretation out there, and there are many others. At this moment, what we can generally see, at most, is the psychological key. And we cannot fail to mention, because it would be an extreme injustice, that in this psychological key of interpreting ancient traditions, Carl Gustav Jung was a master in context. What he says is brilliant. Now, there are other keys besides the psychological one. Helena Blavatsky spoke of peoples from the past who had only 2 keys, had only 3 keys. It's hard for me to know how many keys we have today. I think it's the psychological aspect and more or less, some who have some symbolic vision. A key, according to Helena Blavatsky, she. Describe in 10, and as I told you, then close with a synthesis in 7, which would be the psychological, astronomical, astrological, physiological, metaphysical, anthropological, geometric, mystical, symbolic, and numerical key. In other words, 10 ways for you to read a myth. Then she combines some, the astrological with the astronomical, and forms 7. Be 7 doors, a true myth, a true sacred text, you can enter it with 7 doors. And only when you master the 7 gates do you exhaust the content of a myth or a sacred document of this type that we have in hand. Therefore, do not be mistaken, nor have expectations that I have any pretensions. In reading this book that aims to explain, to delve into what is accessible to us through the psychological key, but with all the humility in the world. That there's no other way to get in. It would be a crazy presumption. Who are we? I find it interesting and brought it to read to you quickly, just as a mention, something that is described in the book's preface by the translator. He talks about some names that were great admirers. From the Hermetic corpus of the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, which would include Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Lactantius, the theologians of the Chartres school, Iamblichus, Eusebius of Caesarea, Proclus, Peter Abelard, a great exponent of the Chartres school, Bernard Sylvester, John of Salisbury, Alain de Lille, Albertus Magnus, the great Albertus Magnus, a great alchemist. Thomas Bradwardine, Marsilio Fitino, evidently, and Pico della Mirandola, Johannes Hosling, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, quite well known, Paracelsus, Giordano Bruno, John Dee, Heinrich Conrad, Robert Flood, what else? Friedrich Heinrich, Jacobi, the Rosicrucian movement, Goethe, now already entering the era of German Romanticism and idealism, Franz Baader, Hegel, Schelling, Arthur Schopenhauer, who was notably an admirer, despite having diverged a bit in his work. And who else? Well, up to our century, we have thinkers like, for example, Fernando Pessoa himself and others who admire this work, Carl Jung himself, who admire this work for the greatness it truly has. In other words, great figures throughout history have kept the flame of the Corpus Hermeticum alive and believed in how grand this document was and is. In other words, even if we cannot understand everything, We must not let ourselves be carried away by our vanity and arrogance to think that what I do not understand has no meaning. The first step for anyone who intends to seek some degree of wisdom is to recognize their own ignorance. Remember Socrates, I only know that I know nothing. Finally, wrapping up our chat today, I brought you an excerpt from Poimandres, that is, from God himself, speaking with Hermes. Control your words. I, who am the Supreme Intelligence, stand beside the saints, the good, the pure, the charitable, those who live in piety. My power is an aid to them, and they soon know all things. In other words, the earliest origin we can recognize in our days, of which we have news, is the idea that the path of good is the path that leads all beings back home, back to unity. And that kindness is what restores all levels of life. Kindness is capable of restoring even the mental and physical health of the human being, according to these traditions. And kindness leads us to God. This is basically what I brought for you. Some really basic elements, very foundational, so that we can start from there, those who will follow us on Acropolisplay to read this book. Let's see what speed we can print. 2, 3 pages a week. Let's see. And it'll be waiting for you there. I ask that you help us spread the word. You know that Acropolisplay is a platform with a monthly fee of 2,090 Brazilian reals per month. And a large part of this, besides the maintenance costs, this influx of resources goes to our social work. Children for Good and IP Art in Belém do Pará. So I invite you to join us on this journey. Thank you very much to everyone and good night.